Your experience is not the reality. So after this clickbaitish title, I have to do some explaining. So in this video we're gonna concentrate on embodied habits and the ways we model the world in our experience. So let's dive right into it. So in the last video I quickly mentioned about these habits that are inside our system and explained that they are basically the models or the maps with which we model the world that we perceive and experience. So this needs some elaboration. So let's start with perception. In perception, or we may also say sensation, we get the first perceptions about the world, naturally. But these are dependent on our senses. So we sense the world based on our sense organs. This immediately sets some limitations to our experience. For example, consider sounds. You are not able to hear very high-pitched sounds, like for example dogs are, or you are not able to see ultraviolet light, as for example snakes are able. So this immediately makes our experiences different compared to, let's say, animals. For example, think about the differences of your experience and an experience of a bat. There is a great difference solely based on the capabilities of perceiving or sensing the environment. So that is, in a sense, the first step to modeling, the idea that what you are able to sense in perception. But now, after you have a sensation, a habit or a model or a map is applied to that sensation, and it basically tells you what this sensation means. It gives meaning to that sensation. It makes that sensation a real sign. And although the perceptions or sensations may be identical, this modeling of those sensations can be very different. For example, think about fishes in a lake. Now, I'm not an expert on fishes by any means, but let's say that these fishes in a lake perceive the environment in a very similar way, almost, let's assume, in a completely identical way. Now, let's say that there are two fishes. There is a pike and there is a roach, and they both perceive a buzz. So the sensation is basically identical. They perceive the buzz in a completely identical way. But now the modeling is very different. The pike sees this buzz as prey. So the modeling, which brings meaning to this sensation or this perception, makes it a sign of potential prey. Whereas the roach, although seeing completely identical or perceiving completely identical sensation, in turn models this buzz as a predator, a potential threat to this roach. So although the perceptions were identical, this modeling was very different, and it made this same, physically the completely same thing, the buzz, very different for the pike and for the roach. The modeling was very different. It was a completely different sign with a completely different meaning. And this led, of course, to different actions. The pike and the roach had same perception, but they had different modelings. This perception of a buzz had different meanings for these fishes, which led to different actions. So the roach fled, whereas the pike attacked the buzz. So you can see how this modeling affects action Or let's take another example that has more to do with our experience. Let's say there are two people standing next to each other and both of them perceive a Cadillac. So the perception is identical, of course, but now the modeling differs again. So the other is a Cadillac enthusiast and is really into Cadillacs, and that's the modeling. So that car, that Cadillac, is a sign of something cool. So the action or the reaction to that experience of seeing a Cadillac is enthusiasm. It's like, that's a cool car. Whereas the other person is a very conscious of environmental things, let's say, and perceives this Cadillac as something that pollutes the environment, which leads into an action of maybe disgust. And you can see again how the perception is completely identical, but the modeling, the meaning that is attached to that perception, or how that sensation is turned into a sign of something, differs, leading into different actions or reactions or different thoughts about that physically completely same object. So going back to the statement at the beginning that your experience is not the reality means just that your experience is firstly limited by your perception, meaning it's limited by your sense organs, what they are capable of perceiving, and furthermore these sensations are then interpreted by your internal model, by your internal habits, which means that different systems give different meanings to the same things. Our perception is limited, and then our perceptions are interpreted by our habits, in a sense that the experience that we have is in a sense different than the reality in itself. Now, in the previous video, I also said that these models can be understood as habits, and we have the word habit here. So how this model is a habit? Well, let's think about those fishes again. That modeling of a bus is a habit, is a habitual interpretation, habitual understanding of that object. The roach has a habit of interpreting bus as a threat, and the pike has a habit of interpreting a roach as something to eat. It's a habit of interpretation. So this modeling is synonymous with habits. Or in the Cadillac example, this Cadillac enthusiast has a habit of interpreting Cadillacs as something cool, whereas this environmentalist has a habit of interpreting cars as something that pollutes the environment. It's a habit of interpretation which can be seen as a model or a map of the world. I guess I have to say something about language as well. As we know, words in our language are symbols, meaning that the way we attach the sign to its object or the sound to a certain kind of concept is through a habit. That means that language in itself is a habit system, and we have to internalize that habit system in order to use it. We have to accept that these kinds of sounds mean these kinds of things before we can really use language. And again, this is seen in this diagram as this internalized or embodied habit. And again, language is a habit system, but at the same time it also models the world. The language affects the way we understand the world. In the last video we did this kind of turnaround with the perception action cycle and noticed how in perception the environment acts upon us, and how when we act upon the environment perceives our action. Now let's do that also to the habit. And I have to say this is something completely new that I just discovered after the last video, so let's see what happens. So in the last video, as I just explained, we noticed how the environment acts upon us when we perceive, and how when we act, the environment perceives our action. But now let's add this habit to this diagram as well. Now let's inquire what this means. So when we perceive something, as said, the environment acts upon us. But this action of the environment is an instance of some habit, some, we may say, environmental habit. This leads us to a very important idea. The idea that the habits of a system have to be in a harmony with the habits of the environment, so that the movement in this diagram would be very fluid and frictionless. The idea is that when we have a habit that is in a very good harmony in the environment, we may keep that habit. Whereas if our habit is not in a harmony with the habits of the environment, at some point we have to change it, because these habits flow into our system as actions, and they force us to take these actions into account. And if those actions are contradictory to our habits, at some point this cruelty of reality, this forcefulness of secondness compels us to accept these facts of reality, and we have to change our behavior. So this harmony can be understood as similarity between our habits and the habits of the environment. And metaphorically, we could say that as a system, we seek to be in the same rhythm with our environment. We want to dance in the same rhythm with our environment. For example, let's think about trees. Now, trees have a habit of dropping their leaves in autumn. Now, they drop their leaves in the autumn as they perceive some change in the environment. Now, I don't know what that change is. I'm not an expert on trees, but let's say it's something to do with temperature. So they perceive a change in temperature, which is also an action of the environment upon that system, that tree system, which, because this tree has a habit, this tree has modeled the world in a certain sense, that this temperature change means that autumn is coming, leading to the action of dropping the leaves, which is something that the environment again perceives. Now, the point here is that this fall of temperature is an instance of an habit or a law that has to do with the planet Earth going around the sun, which causes the different times of a year. So in other words, the habits of the tree and the habits of the planet Earth going around the sun are in harmony. This habit that the tree has embodied is very frictionless with the environmental habits, and basically it works. Now, if those habits of that tree were not attuned to the environment, let's say that the tree would not drop its leaves, that would lead ultimately to the death of that tree, as its habits are not well attuned with the habits of that environment. So sooner or later it has to adapt to its environment and change its habits so that they are better attuned, in a better harmony with the habits of environment. Or let's now again take some example that is more close to experience. Let's say that you have some bundle of habits that you do every day, and those are in well harmony with your environment. And your environment in this example is your apartment in a, let's say, a city. Now, everything works because your habits are well attuned to the habits of your environment. But when you change your environment, let's say you go hiking and you sleep in a forest for a week or so, your environment changes and you have to change your habits with it. You cannot use those same habits that you use in a city when you are in a forest. That would lead to catastrophic consequences. So you have to change your habits. And if you don't, then these habits of environment, which actualize as actions that you perceive, will force you to change your habits. So we can generalize this principle and say that every system seeks to minimize friction, minimize conflict with its environment, meaning that systems seek to adopt habits that are well attuned to the habits of their environment. And when the environment changes, the habits that are embodied by systems need to change as well. So there is a constant back and forth going between the system and its environment, this kind of a constant dance where the system seeks to be in the same rhythm as its environment. So there is the strategy that the system changes its habits to be better tuned to the habits of the environment. But there is another strategy, and that is that the system changes its environment so that the environment is better attuned to the habits of that system. So, for example, beaver will change its environment when it builds a dam. It changes its environment to be better attuned to the habits of beaver. And we humans have mastered this. We change our environment in a very radical way to be better tuned to our ways of living, our habits. For example, cities are great examples of man-made environments that are well attuned to our habits. So there are these two strategies. Either the system changes its habits or the system changes the environment and therefore the environmental habits. Lastly, we can explore this diagram in a more philosophical sense. And there, this environmental habit is very crucial. Now, let's think about modernism. As I explained in the introductory video, modernism saw that humans can bring rationality into the world. This means that human system or human society as a system should bring its habits through actions to the environment and change these environmental habits to be more rational. Now, the postmodern stance, on the other hand, would say that these system habits inside this system are completely arbitrary. We have no possibility of distinguishing what is rational and what is not. And so when we act on the environment based on our habits, it is completely arbitrary. There's actually nothing to be said about those things. So what is then new in this Persian worldview, or semiotism as I call it? Well, it's these environmental habits. It's the idea that these environmental habits are rational. And it is not the case that the only possibility of rational behavior is to act on the environment and make it more rational, but there is also the possibility of listening to this and inquiring these environmental habits and changing our own habits to be better tuned to those larger environmental habits. And that would be considered rational behavior, rational sense making. Furthermore, there's the idea of this perception-action cycle, which was the subject of the last video. More precisely, the idea that perception and action, so the perception-action cycle, goes through this system boundary, that when we perceive, we really perceive the environment, and when we act, it really acts upon the environment. And furthermore, this idea that when we perceive, that's an act of the environment, and when we act, that's a perception for the environment. So this point is seen in the diagram in these arrows that go through this boundary. Whereas both modernism and postmodernism share this common idea that our perceptions and actions are contained in our experience. They are internal to our system, meaning that we have no possibility of really perceiving the reality, really being in contact with our environment, which led to the problem of the external world. This idea that if our experience is completely internal to us, then we have no possibility of knowing whether there is something outside of our minds, and there is no possibility of inquiring that world that is outside of our systems. So for the modernist and postmodernist, this perception action cycle is completely internal to our system, internal to our minds, and when we perceive, we just perceive the contents of our mind and not an action of the environment. But I guess that's enough for this video. This diagram is pretty messy at this point, so we leave it there. But we will be back next week with a new video where we look at the two modes of thought. It's a very interesting, very important theme. I really look forward to it. So subscribe to this channel if you haven't, share this video with your friends, leave a thumbs up, and good sign hunting. And one last thing, fellow sign lovers, I will be releasing a new video every Friday from now on, so stay tuned for more.